You can't just destroy someone's fence because you don't like it. The words flew out of my mouth with more indignation than I'd felt in decades. Yet there I was, staring down the splintered remains of my once proud backyard boundary. And the culprit? A ruthless, rule-wielding Karen from our homeowners association. If you want to find out exactly how I turned the tables on the most tyrannical neighbor this side of the Atlantic, keep reading, because I made sure she regretted that day for a very, very long time. My name is Russell, a retired school principal. To most people, I'm just a friendly guy with a passion for gardening and well-organized file folders. I moved into this suburban neighborhood for a peaceful life after decades of working in education. I wanted to cultivate a small garden, read my newspapers in a rocking chair, and wave kindly at passersby. Little did I know I'd end up locked in a petty war with a woman who practically believed she was the embodiment of the HOA itself. Before the fence fiasco, I'd only heard about Karen's all-consuming obsession with neighborhood regulations. Rumors flew around about her measuring the distance between mailboxes and curb edges, or taking photos of unapproved flower colors on her phone. She posted frequent rants on our community's online bulletin board about eyesores and miscreants who degrade our property values. Naturally, I dismissed most of it as overblown gossip. I'd encountered enough difficult personalities in my years as a principal. Usually, all it took was a calm conversation to find common ground. Or so I thought. My fence, a lovely cedar barrier, was built many years ago by my late father and me. We did it in a style reminiscent of the wooden fences you'd see surrounding old farmhouses. It wasn't bright pink or covered in graffiti. It was just cedar slats about 6 feet high with a slight arch at the top. None of the neighbors had ever complained in the 3 years I'd owned this home. If anything, folks admired it for its craftsmanship. Because Dad and I had carefully sealed and stained every plank by hand, it stood out in a classy, timeless way. But apparently, it also stood out to Karen, who got voted onto our HOA board last spring. Ever since she took that position, she'd been like a merciless captain steering a ship of outlandish regulations. From what I gathered, her greatest concern seemed to be neighborhood uniformity. She wanted every house painted one of 3 HOA-approved shades of beige or light gray. She insisted on identical mailboxes, identically trimmed hedges, and identically shaped fences. Of course, these fences looked more like cheap plastic picket dividers than real barriers. But the uniform fence style was apparently non-negotiable, and no exception was made for existing structures, despite the HOA's own bylaws stating older fences could be grandfathered in. I first learned of her discontent when I received a tersely worded letter stuffed in my mailbox. It cited some obscure rule about how new standards for fence design had been enacted and that all homeowners were expected to comply by the next inspection date. Next to this line was a black and white photocopy of a cheap vinyl fence, its only distinction being the brand name slapped across the top. I was vaguely insulted they would compare my beautiful cedar fence to a generic kit. The letter ended with the phrase, "Failure to comply will result in fines and potential removal." Now, I'm not one to overreact, but something about the tone of that letter irked me. I mulled over the possibility that this was just a standard HOA notice, perhaps triggered automatically for anyone with a wooden fence. Maybe no one actually expected me to rip down my perfectly good enclosure just to replace it with an inferior one. So I decided to call the HOA office and ask for clarification. That was my first official brush with Karen. Her voice, so saccharine it made my teeth hurt, greeted me. "Hello, Russell," she sang in a tone that might have been pleasant if not for the underlying condescension. "I suppose you're calling about our new fence guidelines?" "I am," I said, trying to sound warm but firm. "My fence predates the new guidelines. Your own bylaws say that older fences can remain as long as they're well-maintained. So, I don't see the problem here." "Well," she said with a patronizing giggle, "the guidelines have changed. I'm afraid that means you'll need to replace that fence. We're moving to a cohesive look in our neighborhood." I pictured her flipping through her binder of outdated rules, searching for a reason to push me around. "I understand that, but as I mentioned, your bylaws explicitly mention that." "You know," she interrupted, "it's unfortunate when folks don't want to keep the community looking its best. I'm sure you love your fence, but it's not in line with our vision. And that was that. She said, "Have a lovely day," and hung up. I was so stunned by her briskness that I took a moment to realize she hadn't actually addressed any of my concerns. She hadn't once acknowledged the existing clause that let my fence remain or provided any real justification. That's when I realized this wasn't simply about a fence. Karen thrived on control, and my fence was just the next object of her crusade. At that point, I decided to stand my ground. I wouldn't be bullied into spending thousands of dollars to replace a perfectly good, structurally sound, and personally sentimental fence just so it met the bland, one-size-fits-all aesthetic of the neighborhood. After all, I had rights too, and the bylaws were on my side. What I didn't realize, however, was that Karen had no intention of going through the proper legal channels to get her way. Instead, she did the unthinkable. She destroyed my fence herself, without my permission, without a court order, without anything. By the time I discovered the damage, it was too late. My heart nearly exploded in my chest when I walked into my backyard that morning, coffee mug in hand, to find half of my cedar fence torn down and piled haphazardly in a corner of my yard. Panic, rage, and disbelief all hit me at once. How dare someone barge onto my property and rip apart something so important to me? And how on earth could she do it with such brazen confidence? Part of me wanted to call the police right then and there, but first, I needed to breathe and figure out exactly what had happened. And that's where the real battle began. I stood on my back porch, the mild morning sun glinting off the broken wooden boards. A single, twisted nail caught my eye. It glimmered in the light almost mockingly, like a final testament to the destruction. Anger surged inside me. But amid the fury, a strategy started taking shape. My years as a principal had taught me something. Never walk into a confrontation unprepared. Emotions might drive you, but facts win the day. My first call was to the non-emergency police line. I explained that someone had destroyed my property without my consent. The operator asked if I had any evidence that Karen was responsible. Not yet, I admitted, but I have a strong suspicion. Then, I called a friend, Robert, who was somewhat of a tech hobbyist. If anyone could help me figure out how this happened and who did it, it was him. Robert came over that afternoon, and after surveying the damage, he suggested we check any available security cameras. I pointed out my front door camera wouldn't capture the backyard, and my neighbor's cameras mostly faced the street. "That's no help," I sighed. He nodded, scratching his chin. "What about the community clubhouse? Doesn't it have cameras near the pool and tennis courts?" I blinked. The community's tennis courts were behind my property, separated from my backyard only by a row of thick bushes. If the cameras were angled just right, there was a chance they had recorded someone walking along the perimeter. Before we hurried off to investigate, I decided I needed at least some photographic evidence of the crime scene for my own records. The jagged remains of my fence told a story. Nails pulled out with a crowbar, boards snapped in half rather than sawed. Karen, or whoever she hired, hadn't exactly been subtle. I spent a good hour methodically documenting the scene from every angle. That small act of gathering evidence brought me a measure of calm, like I was reclaiming some control in the chaos. Our next stop was the community clubhouse. I half expected Karen to be there, staked out like an eagle preening its feathers. But she wasn't, and I was able to speak with the clubhouse manager, Sandra, who recognized me as the retired principal from the big brick house. When I casually mentioned fence vandalism, her eyes widened with concern. "Are you serious? Someone tore down your fence?" she asked, genuinely shocked. "Half of it," I corrected, "and I'm trying to find out who." Robert stepped in. "We're wondering if maybe the security cameras near the tennis courts might have caught something." Sandra pursed her lips. HOA policy states that camera footage is only for official HOA business, like investigating vandalism to common areas. "But this is vandalism," I countered gently, "and it's basically on the perimeter of the common area." She hesitated, looking around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "Well, let me see what I can do," she said, "because if it happened during the day, or even early evening, we might have a chance." I expected a simple procedure, maybe an incident report or permission slip. Instead, Sandra led us behind the clubhouse's office area to a small control room with a bank of monitors. She flicked through a set of digital recordings, each labeled by date and time. Soon enough, she found the relevant time frame from the previous day. A few minutes of fast-forwarding through footage showed kids at the tennis court, a family strolling by with a dog, and then, around mid-afternoon, an older green truck rolling quietly along the side road behind my fence. We watched, transfixed as the truck slowed down. A tall figure got out, a person wearing a bright turquoise windbreaker. Even on the grainy screen, the color was unmistakable. Then, the figure removed something from the truck bed, what looked like a heavy metal crowbar or pry bar. My jaw clenched. This was it, the first real evidence we had. The figure disappeared behind the thick shrubbery that separated my fence from the tennis courts. It was impossible to see the exact face in the fuzzy video, but the stance, the silhouette, my stomach sank. I recognized the posture, the short hair, the stiff shoulders. It had to be Karen. But if there was any doubt left, it vanished when the person dropped what looked like a large folder from under their arm. They bent down to retrieve it, and under the bright afternoon sun, we saw the embossed letters on the cover, HOA. Sandra let out a low whistle. Robert muttered, "Bingo." The footage ended with the figure walking back to the truck and driving off. We saw the timestamp, 3:37 p.m. That meant Karen had spent at least 30 minutes in my yard, presumably tearing down my fence. She hadn't even bothered to disguise herself. Did she think she was invincible? Armed with this footage, I felt a surge of righteous indignation mixed with cautious relief. Proof was exactly what I needed, and this was more than proof. This was Karen, red-handed. "Can you save that clip for me?" I asked Sandra quietly. She nodded, popping in a USB drive to download the relevant portion. "I'm not sure if I'm allowed to officially give this to you," she said carefully, "but as far as I'm concerned, I'm just hitting the export button for internal records. If you happen to have a copy, that might be purely coincidental." I thanked her from the bottom of my heart. As Robert and I left, I felt the wheels of my strategy turning faster. Karen had crossed a line, legally, ethically, and personally. She tried to hide behind the HOA's authority to intimidate me, but that same authority she clutched so tightly was about to become her downfall. After returning home, I called the non-emergency line again, this time with the new evidence. An officer, Sergeant Hewitt, showed up the next day to take my statement. He wasn't brimming with optimism, reminding me that lawsuits involving HOAs could be complicated, but he did say having video evidence would strengthen my case. Meanwhile, I braced myself for any backlash Karen might unleash when she realized I was pursuing the matter. I didn't have to wait long. Early the next morning, as I tried to salvage what was left of my fence boards, I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clacking on pavement. Within seconds, Karen's crisp voice pierced the air. "You know, Russell," she said, folding her arms, "it's a shame it came to this." Her words were so smug, as if she genuinely believed she was doing the neighborhood a favor. I turned to face her, forcing myself to keep my posture steady and my face calm. "This was my property, Karen," I said, gesturing to the ruined fence. "You can't do that." She shrugged. "The HOA has the right to enforce community standards. If you won't comply, we act." I took a deep breath. "Not like this. You broke the law." Her lips curled into a dismissive smirk. "I wouldn't threaten me if I were you, Russell. I know the bylaws inside and out." I could almost see the power trip shining in her eyes, but I had a quiet confidence of my own. I knew about the footage, and soon enough, she would too. As she turned on her heel, presumably to go back to her morning patrol of everyone else's trash placement or driveway cleanliness, I gave her a final warning. "We'll see what the police and a lawyer have to say about that." She threw back a mocking laugh. "Go ahead." In that moment, I knew there was no reasoning with her. She wasn't just oblivious to her wrongdoing. She relished the conflict. But I also knew something she didn't, that humiliating a law-abiding neighbor might look good for her ego, but it wouldn't stand a chance in a legal arena, especially with that damning security footage in my possession. So began my meticulous plan of action. Contact an attorney, file a claim, and gather support from anyone else who might be fed up with Karen's tyrannical brand of HOA enforcement. Little did I know, I wasn't the only one who'd been targeted by her. My destroyed fence turned out to be the final straw for a lot of homeowners who had kept quiet out of fear. And once people started talking, Karen's world would begin to crumble. A few days after I'd filed my police report and consulted with an attorney, the neighborhood started buzzing like a hive of hornets, disturbed by a meddling intruder. Word got around that Karen destroyed Russell's fence, and, apparently, this wasn't her first overreach. Suddenly, my phone was ringing off the hook with neighbors I barely knew, each wanting to share their own run-ins with her. There was Linda, who got an exorbitant fine for planting her marigolds a few inches too close to the sidewalk. Bill, who had to repaint his front door 3 times in 1 year because Karen changed the approved color list on a whim. Even Tom, a Vietnam veteran at the end of the block, had been forced by Karen to remove a small, respectful wind chime from his porch under some ridiculous claim that metal ornaments caused disturbing noise pollution. These stories were petty and absurd, and they all had Karen's fingerprints on them. But in each case, the homeowners had felt cornered. Karen's relentless intimidation, veiled threats of legal action, and her knowledge of every obscure bylaw had silenced many. However, my fence fiasco brought a wave of solidarity among us. People were outraged that she had physically trespassed and destroyed property. The next thing I knew, Linda suggested we form a small coalition, an informal group dedicated to confronting Karen's tyranny head-on. We called ourselves the Fair Housing Collective. It was Linda's idea, and we all agreed it sounded official enough to not be dismissed. Our goal was to gather evidence of Karen's overreaches, present them to the HOA board, and, if necessary, pursue legal action to remove her from her position. It was a bold move, and we all knew it would ruffle feathers. But the days of sitting quietly while Karen ran amok were over. First, we met in my living room, 5 neighbors plus Robert, who was happy to lend his tech prowess. We shared stories, collected letters, and compiled photographs of the times Karen had crossed the line. Robert set up a shared online folder so we could keep everything organized. Everything from angry notes she had left on front doors to photos of fines that were triple the usual amount, suspiciously signed off on by HOA enforcement, KW. Karen's initials, of course. Tom brought a stack of official HOA newsletters where Karen had inserted extra paragraphs, clarifying regulations. But upon closer inspection, those clarifications were nowhere to be found in the official bylaw documents. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a line about holiday decorations. "She claims no seasonal decor can stay up more than 48 hours, but the actual HOA guidelines say 14 days. He shook his head, lips pressed in a thin line. "She's making it up to bully us." In the midst of all this, my attorney, Rebecca Lloyd, had been working on drafting a formal cease and desist letter directed at Karen personally, as well as a demand for reimbursement for the damages to my fence. Since the footage so clearly identified her, Rebecca felt confident we had a strong case. But that was just step one. If Karen refused to acknowledge wrongdoing or pay for repairs, we could escalate it to a civil suit. Meanwhile, the police investigation was ongoing, but these cases can be slow to progress. My biggest fear was that Karen would try to manipulate the rest of the HOA board into downplaying or excusing her actions. So, our coalition decided to attend the next official HOA meeting, an open session where homeowners could air grievances and concerns. It was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the clubhouse's conference hall. Linda and Tom spread the word around the neighborhood, encouraging everyone to attend. The day of the meeting, I must have received a dozen calls from neighbors asking how to speak or if they needed to sign up in advance to present their issues. I told them simply, show up, speak up, and do not be intimidated. When the evening arrived, I headed to the clubhouse early. I'll admit, my heart pounded like a drum in my chest. Despite my years of dealing with rowdy students and demanding parents, there is something uniquely nerve-wracking about confronting an HOA tyrant on her own turf. The conference hall was a modest room with folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a long table at the front. Karen sat there, flanked by 2 other board members who wore uneasy expressions. The room quickly filled with neighbors. Usually, these meetings drew maybe a handful of attendees. That night, We had over 30 people crammed in, with a few even standing along the back wall. And every single one of them had a story, a question, or a complaint about Karen's overstepping. The meeting began with the usual formalities, reading the minutes from the last session, a brief financial report, and so on. Karen kept glancing at the crowd, her posture rigid, her smile looking more forced by the second. She cleared her throat. Now, we moved to open forum. Any community concerns? That's when it began. Linda stepped forward, carefully adjusting her reading glasses. She spoke politely but firmly about how Karen had singled her out for unapproved color schemes in her garden. She cited the actual bylaw that clearly permitted any commonly available plant. Then Bill stood up, brandishing pictures of his door in 3 different shades, all of which had been deemed unacceptable by Karen. Tom shared how he was forced to remove his wind chime. Others chimed in about suspicious fines, short-notice changes to rules, and threats of forced compliance. Karen tried to keep her composure, but she started snapping back with thinly veiled scolding. "You must respect the board's decisions," she would say, or, "I'm just enforcing the rules for the betterment of the community." But with each new person speaking, the tension in the room mounted. The other 2 board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. One of them, a woman named Deborah, actually apologized to Bill about the door paint fiasco, saying she had no knowledge of that policy. It became clear that Karen had been acting unilaterally in many cases. Finally, I stood up. My palms were sweaty, but I held my voice steady. "I've got a concern, and it's more serious. My fence was recently destroyed, and I have evidence that Karen trespassed and dismantled it without my permission." At that point, a collective gasp swept the room. Karen gave me a seething glare. She opened her mouth to retort, but I beat her to it. "I've already filed a police report, and this matter is under investigation." Someone else called out, "She can't do that." Another neighbor, Linda's husband, said, "That's criminal behavior." I reached into my bag and pulled out several printed still shots of the security footage, which clearly showed Karen in her distinctive turquoise jacket carrying that crowbar. I held them up so everyone could see. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's face went white as a sheet. She tried to regain her composure, stammering, I was forced to act because your fence was not in compliance." One of the board members interrupted, sounding exasperated. "Karen, we don't have the power to forcibly remove a fence without giving proper notice, going through a hearing, and obtaining a court order if necessary. This is a serious violation." The hush that fell over the room then was deafening. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. I could see it dawn on her that she might have finally overplayed her hand. She stumbled over some excuse about trying to protect property values, but no one was buying it. Embarrassed, the other board member, Deborah, cleared her throat. "I think we should make a motion to place Karen on temporary suspension from the board, pending an official investigation." The crowd erupted in agreement. Karen tried to protest, but Deborah and the other board member swiftly overruled her. The meeting ended soon after with a formal statement that the board would convene an emergency session to review the evidence. Karen stormed out, her face tight with anger. That night, as I walked back home alongside my neighbors, I felt a weight lifting off the entire community's shoulders. People were sharing relieved smiles and hushed exclamations of victory. But I knew this wasn't over yet. Karen was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals are dangerous. Still, for the first time in months, I felt a real sense of hope. We were standing up to her, and she had nowhere left to hide. Within days of that tumultuous HOA meeting, word spread that Karen had been officially suspended from all board activities, pending the outcome of a formal investigation by the HOA's legal counsel. Despite her best efforts to justify her fence destruction as HOA enforcement, the evidence was too damning. Neighbors who had once feared her found newfound courage in numbers. I anticipated Karen might retaliate in some underhanded way, but for a time, everything was eerily quiet. No suspicious letters, no sudden citations, no confrontations on my porch. It was as if she'd vanished. But I wasn't foolish enough to think she'd given up. My attorney and I were prepared to escalate the matter if she refused to pay for fence repairs. Then, one morning, an official-looking envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was from Karen's personal attorney. The letter inside was a bizarre mix of half-hearted apologies and disclaimers. While my client firmly believes her actions were in line with maintaining community standards, she acknowledges that certain misunderstandings have arisen. It began. I read on, eyebrows arching higher with each sentence. The letter offered to pay for the cost of rebuilding my fence, but only if I signed a non-disclosure agreement stating I wouldn't publicly discuss the incident or pursue further legal action against her. It was a classic hush-money tactic. I was livid. Not only was she avoiding taking real responsibility, she wanted me to shut up about it forever. I immediately called my lawyer, Rebecca. She advised me not to sign anything unless the terms were favorable. "You've got her cornered," Rebecca said. "She's scared, and she's trying to cover her tracks. If you sign that NDA, she'll keep terrorizing the community without consequences. Your call, but I suggest we push for full restitution and a formal apology without the gag order." I agreed wholeheartedly. Karen needed to face the music, not sweep her bad behavior under the rug. So, we drafted a counterproposal. She would pay the full cost of fence repairs, plus some compensation for the emotional distress, and issue a written apology to the HOA board and neighborhood. No NDA. No hush money. Karen's response came through her attorney again. She grudgingly agreed to pay for the repairs and a modest sum for damages, but refused to issue a public apology. By that point, the HOA's own investigation was wrapping up, with even stronger indications that her unilateral actions violated numerous rules. The board was on the verge of removing her permanently. Her reputation in the neighborhood was in tatters, and she risked facing criminal trespassing and vandalism charges if the police and district attorney decided to pursue it fully. Throughout this standoff, my neighbors and I continued to strengthen our little fair housing collective. We updated each other on Karen's doings, or lack thereof, while pushing the board to revise the HOA guidelines, ensuring no single individual could unilaterally impose new rules. One evening, Linda and Bill came over to help me measure out the cost of new cedar boards. They insisted on paying for some of the materials out of solidarity. I kindly refused. Though the gesture moved me, I didn't want them financially burdened. But it warmed my heart to see how this ordeal had forged a real sense of community. A week later, in a final twist of drama, Karen herself showed up on my doorstep. It was late afternoon, golden sunlight stretching across the porch. I heard a tentative knock, opened the door, and there she stood, looking oddly small and anxious without her usual smugness. "Russell," she began quietly. "May I come in?" I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I led her to the living room. She perched on the edge of my couch, twisting her hands together. It struck me then that she looked genuinely frazzled. I want to talk to you directly," she said. "My attorney, well, she's handling things formally, but I thought maybe we could come to an understanding." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean you want me to drop the legal proceedings if you pay for the fence?" She let out a tremulous sigh. "Yes, partly, but also, I realize I may have taken things too far." Her voice cracked slightly. "You see, my husband left me 2 years ago. My children are grown and moved away, and I guess I got used to controlling the only area of my life I could, the HOA." Those words hung in the air, brimming with a raw vulnerability I hadn't expected. I felt a small stir of pity, but I reminded myself, pity doesn't erase wrongdoing. Yet in that moment, I understood that her obsession had roots in insecurity and loneliness. She had latched onto the HOA like a lifeline, using it to fill a void by micromanaging others' lives. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "I know I should have handled it differently." I took a moment before responding. "I appreciate the apology," I said. "But you need to understand, you did real damage, not just to my fence, but to the sense of trust and peace in this neighborhood. You didn't just overstep a boundary, you broke it literally." She nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks now. "I know." I sat back, letting out a slow breath. If this had happened a month ago, I might have felt satisfaction seeing her brought low by her own actions. But after all the tension, my chief desire was for justice and for the community to be free of her tyranny, not to see her suffer endlessly. I'll see what my attorney recommends, I told her gently. I'm not going to pretend this never happened. But if you're willing to make amends and step away from the board, maybe we can all move forward. Karen nodded, eyes downcast. Then she stood up, thanked me quietly, and left. I watched her walk away from my porch, that turquoise jacket clutched in one trembling hand. In the weeks that followed, she made good on her promise to pay for the fence, and she agreed to a fair settlement for damages. She also stepped down from the HOA board entirely, which was a relief for everyone involved. The board, now under Deborah's leadership, re-established guidelines that protected homeowners from unilateral decisions. They also clarified the process for addressing any real violations in a transparent, neighborly manner: hearings, official warnings, and actual board votes. As for me, I rebuilt my cedar fence with renewed vigor. Robert and Tom helped me choose an even sturdier design, ensuring it would stand firm through future storms, natural or otherwise. Linda dropped off a new flower arrangement for my garden, saying she wanted something beautiful to mark the new era. And the transformation in the neighborhood was almost immediate. People felt free to repaint doors, enjoy their wind chimes, and plant flowers without that constant anxiety. In the end, Karen faced her consequences. Although the district attorney declined to press criminal charges, the civil settlement and her forced resignation were punishment enough to wake her up to the damage she'd caused. While we never became friends, I occasionally saw her walking around the block, head lowered, a subdued version of her former self. I'd be lying if I said I felt sorry for her downfall, but I did hope she'd find peace in something other than controlling others. My fence, once a cherished symbol of father-son craftsmanship, became more than just a boundary between properties. It became a testament to standing up for what's right. Sometimes, after finishing my morning coffee, I could step outside and run a hand along the new cedar boards. Remembering that day, I found them in splinters. A sense of pride and relief settles in. Because despite the turmoil, we, as a neighborhood, stood together. And we proved that no matter how strong a Karen's grip on power might seem, a united community can take it back. If you ever find yourself at the mercy of a tyrannical HOA board member, don't suffer in silence. Gather your neighbors, document everything, and stay calm but resolute. Even the most domineering Karen can be held accountable when you stand up for your rights and for each other. After all, fences may mark our property lines, but community is what truly brings us together.